The Countess's reaction to Dr. Mordane's dismissive words about Jake was swift and terrible. For the first time in 3,000 years, she felt the kind of protective rage that humans knew well, but that Zerthi had forgotten how to experience. She rose from her throne with movements that crackled with energy, her eyes blazing with emotions that had been growing stronger with each essence extraction session. Dr. Mordane stepped backward in shock as the Countess declared that Jake was not an animal, but a sentient being whose thoughts and feelings mattered as much as those of any Zerthi noble. She announced that the essence extraction experiments would and immediately, and that all prisoners would be treated with the respect due to intelligent creatures rather than laboratory subjects. The advisors exchanged alarmed glances as they realized that their leader's contamination with human emotions had progressed far beyond what they had believed possible. Commander Veltar stepped forward with his weapon drawn and informed the Countess that she was no longer competent to rule due to her compromised mental state. He declared that the ship's command structure was being transferred to Dr. Mordane until proper Zerthi leadership could be restored. Jake watched in amazement as the alien nobles who had seemed so united in their elegant cruelty suddenly turned against each other. The Countess had allies among her crew who were loyal to her personally rather than to Zerthi traditions, and they moved to defend their leader against the attempted coup. The throne room erupted into chaos as centuries of suppressed tensions finally exploded into open conflict. The fighting gave Jake the opportunity he had been waiting for, to implement the sabotage he had been building into the ship's systems during his extraction sessions. He reached out with his mind to the network connections he had established and triggered the cascade failures that Carl had identified in the power distribution system. Throughout the ship, lights flickered and gravity fluctuated as energy flows were redirected in patterns that the alien computers could not predict or control. Lisa Hayes felt the gravity shifts in her detention area and immediately began the escape sequence that she and her teammates had planned. She moved through corridors that were now poorly lit and filled with confused Zerthi guards who could not understand why their technology was malfunctioning in impossible ways. The ship's security systems were designed to track logical movement patterns, but Lisa's seemingly random path through the vessel completely baffled the monitoring equipment. Carl Brooks reached the engineering section just as the power grid began. To overload in the precise locations he had calculated would cause maximum disruption with minimum permanent damage. He accessed control panels that should have been secured against prisoner interference, but Jake's sabotage had created temporary gaps in the security protocols that allowed human creativity to bypass Zerthi logic. Danny White found himself in the medical bay during a perfect storm of confusion as alien doctors struggled to understand why their equipment was responding to commands that no one had given. He quickly began releasing other prisoners and directing them toward healing devices that could restore their strength, turning victims into potential allies in a matter of minutes. Back in the throne room, the Countess was fighting with abilities she had never known she possessed. The human emotions flowing through her mind had awakened instincts that her people had lost over their long evolution toward peaceful stagnation. She moved with unpredictable patterns that confused her attackers and struck back with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including herself. Jake found that his mental connection with the Countess allowed him to coordinate with her in ways that seemed almost telepathic. He could sense her intentions and guide her toward tactical advantages, while she could feel his knowledge of human combat techniques and apply them with alien strength and speed. Together they fought like a team that had trained for years rather than two beings from different species who had met only weeks before. Dr. Mordane realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control and ordered his supporters to kill both Jake and the Countess before their collaboration could spread human contamination to other members of the crew. He declared that it was better to lose their leader than to risk the infection of their entire civilization with human unpredictability and emotional chaos. The battle intensified as more Zerthi nobles were forced to choose sides between their traditional way of life and the possibility of change that the Countess now represented. Some fought out of loyalty to ancient customs, while others were drawn to the vitality and passion that human influence had brought to their sterile existence. Jake's crew members arrived in the throne room at the critical moment when the Countess's supporters were being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Lisa, Carl, and Danny brought with them dozens of freed prisoners from multiple species, all of them energized by alien medical technology and eager to strike back against their captors. The tide of battle shifted as the throne room filled with beings who had been written off as expendable resources, but who retained the will to fight for their freedom. The Countess fought her way to Jake's side and declared that she finally understood what she had truly been seeking through the essence extraction experiments. She had not needed his life force to make her young again, but rather his humanity to make her feel alive for the first time in centuries. The vitality she craved could not be stolen, but had to be earned through growth, challenge, and connection with others. Dr. Mordain made one final desperate attempt to restore Zerthi order by activating the ship's self-destruct system, declaring that it was better for everyone to die than to allow human chaos to spread throughout their civilization. However, his action only served to prove the Countess's point about the sterility of pure Zerthi logic, as he chose destruction over adaptation when faced with unexpected change. Jake and Carl worked together to override the self-destruct sequence. Using the combination of human creativity and alien technology that had proven so effective throughout their escape, they turned the ship's own advanced systems against the destructive commands, creating new solutions that the original programmers had never imagined would be necessary. The rebellion ended when Commander Veltar realized that his choice was between following Dr. Mordain into pointless destruction or accepting the possibility of renewal that the Countess offered. He laid down his weapons and asked what the human-influenced Zerthi were proposing to do with their victory. The Countess announced that she was establishing a new policy for her section of the Zerthi Empire, one that would be based on cooperation rather than domination and growth rather than stagnation. She offered freedom to all prisoners and invited those who wished to stay to help build something unprecedented, a society that combined the best aspects of multiple species rather than the rigid hierarchy that had ruled the aliens for millennia. Jake accepted the Countess's offer to remain aboard her ship as a cultural advisor and teacher, helping to establish the first human-Zerthi exchange program in galactic history. His crew chose to stay as well, drawn by the opportunity to help create something entirely new rather than simply returning to their old lives as explorers. The story concluded with Jake teaching groups of young Zerthi about human concepts of innovation and emotional growth, while the Countess learned to embrace uncertainty and change as sources of strength rather than threats to be eliminated. She never achieved the eternal youth she had originally sought, but she gained something far more valuable, the ability to continue growing and learning throughout her extended lifetime. The ship became a mobile center for cultural exchange and scientific cooperation, visiting worlds throughout the galaxy and spreading the idea that diversity and change were sources of vitality rather than chaos. Jake discovered that his true purpose was not to explore empty space, but to help different species learn from each other and create new possibilities that none of them could achieve alone. During the 7 Essence extraction session, something unexpected happened that changed everything Jake thought he understood about his situation. As the alien machine drew energy from his life force and transferred it to Countess Zarathiel, Jake felt a strange connection form between their minds that went far beyond the simple energy transfer the Zerthi scientists had intended to create. Through this mental link, Jake could sense the Countess's thoughts and emotions in ways that terrified both of them. He felt her centuries of accumulated boredom and despair, the crushing weight of immortality that had drained all joy from her existence, and her desperate hunger for something that could make her feel alive again. But more disturbing than her, alien thoughts were the new emotions that seemed to be growing within her mind, feelings that were distinctly human in nature. The Countess was experiencing curiosity about things she had never considered before, sudden urges to take risks that would have been unthinkable for a careful Zerathi noble, and flashes of empathy for the prisoners she was keeping aboard her ship. These human emotions were spreading through her ancient mind like wildfire, bringing both excitement and terror as they challenged everything she had believed about herself and her people. Jake realized that the essence extraction process was not simply stealing his life energy, but was actually transferring aspects of his humanity to the alien countess. Each session was making her more human while making him weaker, creating a connection between them that neither the Zerathi scientists nor their advanced technology had anticipated or prepared for. The Countess began visiting Jake more frequently after this discovery, not to discuss the extraction procedures, but to ask him questions about human nature and behavior that she had never needed to understand before. She wanted to know why humans took risks when safety was available, why they formed emotional attachments that could cause pain, and why they continued to hope for better futures, even when their circumstances seemed hopeless. Jake found himself in the strange position of becoming a teacher to his captor, explaining human concepts that the Countess was beginning to experience for the first time in her 3,000-year life. He told her about love and friendship, about the satisfaction that came from overcoming challenges, and about the way humans found meaning in their brief existence by connecting with others and working toward goals that might not be achieved. In their lifetimes, the changes in the Countess did not go unnoticed by her advisors and the other Zerathi nobles who served aboard her ship. Commander Veltar and the other high-ranking aliens began to express concern about their leaders' increasingly erratic behavior, her sudden interest in the welfare of her prisoners, and her willingness to question traditions that had guided their people for millennia. The Zerathi court physician, an ancient being named Dr. Mordain, performed detailed scans of the Countess and discovered evidence of the human contamination that was spreading through her neural pathways. He declared that the essence extraction experiments had gone too far and were threatening to destroy the very essence of what made the Countess a true Zerathi noble. Dr. Mordain convinced the other advisors that their leader was suffering from a form of mental illness caused by prolonged exposure to human thought patterns and emotions. He argued that the only way to save her was to end the extraction experiments immediately and begin treatments that would purge the human influence from her mind before it could spread further. The advisors held secret meetings to discuss their options, debating whether they should forcibly remove the Countess from power or simply eliminate the source of her contamination by killing Jake and his crew. They viewed the human emotions and behaviors that the Countess was displaying as symptoms of a disease that threatened not only her, but potentially their entire civilization. Meanwhile, Lisa Hayes had been making progress with her own escape plans. Using the confusion patterns she had discovered to move through sections of the ship that should have been off limits to prisoners. She found Carl Brooks in the engineering section and Danny White near the medical facilities, and together they began to coordinate their efforts to gather information about the ship's weaknesses and the locations of other prisoners. The three humans discovered that the Zerathi detention systems had several critical flaws that could be exploited by individuals who thought in non-linear patterns. The alien technology was designed to predict and prevent logical escape attempts, but it struggled to counter the kind of improvised plans that humans excelled at creating under pressure. Danny had learned from other prisoners that many of them retained enough strength to help with an escape attempt if they could gain access to the medical equipment that was being used to monitor their condition. The Zerathi had healing technology that could quickly restore vitality to weakened subjects, but it was normally only used to prepare prisoners for additional extraction sessions rather than to actually help them recover. Carl discovered that the ship's power distribution network could be overloaded by creating feedback loops in the energy flow patterns, but only if someone could access multiple control nodes simultaneously while performing actions that the ship's computer could not predict or counter. The task would require perfect timing and coordination between team members working in different sections of the vessel. Jake learned about his crew's escape preparations during one of his mental connections with the Countess. As her growing human, Emotions made her increasingly sympathetic to his concerns about his friend's welfare. She began to share information about the ship's layout and security systems without fully realizing that she was helping him plan against her own people. The crisis came to a head when Dr. Mordain and the other advisors decided that they could no longer wait for the Countess to recover from her human contamination. They staged what they called an intervention, surrounding her in the throne room with armed guards and demanding that she submit to immediate treatment that would restore her proper Zirathi mindset. The Countess found herself torn between her ancient loyalty to her people and the new human emotions that were telling her that what they were doing to their prisoners was fundamentally wrong. For the first time in centuries, she felt anger at the casual way her advisors dismissed the suffering they were causing, and she experienced something she had never known before: moral outrage at injustice. When Dr. Mordain ordered the guards to forcibly sedate the Countess so that treatment could begin, she made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She refused to cooperate and instead called for Jake to be brought to the throne room so that she could hear his perspective on what was happening. The advisors were horrified by this request, as it represented exactly the kind of irrational human behavior they were trying to eliminate from their leader's mind. They argued that allowing further contact with the human prisoner would only make her condition worse and could potentially spread the contamination to other members of the crew. Countess responded with a display of emotion that none of the Zirathi had ever seen from their normally controlled and rational leader. She declared that she would not be treated like a patient or a child, and that if her advisors wanted to remove her from power, they would need to do so through force rather than medical procedures. The confrontation escalated as Jake was brought into the throne room under heavy guard. Weak from his recent extraction session, but still alert enough to understand that something crucial was happening. The Countess looked at him with eyes that now held human warmth alongside alien intelligence, and for the first time since his capture, Jake saw hope that the situation might be resolved without the death of everyone involved. Dr. Mordain made the fatal mistake of declaring that Jake was nothing more than a laboratory animal whose thoughts and feelings were irrelevant to the important decisions that needed to be made about Zirathi policy. The first essence extraction session left Jake feeling like he had been drained of all energy and hope. The Countess had brought him to her private laboratory, a chamber filled with crystalline formations that hummed with power beyond human understanding. The extraction device resembled a throne made of living metal that seemed to breathe and pulse as Jake was secured within its embrace. During the procedure, Jake felt something fundamental being pulled from the core of his being. It was not physical pain, but something deeper, as if the machine was stealing pieces of his soul and feeding them to the beautiful alien woman who watched with hungry eyes. The Countess appeared to grow more vibrant and youthful as the session progressed, while Jake became pale and weak like the subjects he had seen in the recordings. When the session ended, Jake could barely stand without assistance. The alien guards who escorted him back to his quarters moved with careful precision, as if they understood how fragile he had become. The Countess followed behind them, her skin glowing with renewed vitality and her movements filled with energy that had been stolen from Jake's own life force. Over the following days, Jake discovered that his human body was indeed capable of recovering from the extraction, but much more slowly than the Countess had claimed. Each session left him weaker for longer periods, and he began to understand that the alien scientists had miscalculated how much human life force could be safely harvested. They were killing him by degrees, and either they did not realize it, or they did not care enough to stop. However, something unexpected was happening during Jake's recovery periods. As he lay in his luxurious prison, struggling to regain his strength, he began to notice details about the alien technology that surrounded him. The patterns in the walls were not just decorative, but seemed to be part of a vast network that carried information and energy throughout the ship. The lights responded to his presence in subtle ways, and the furniture adjusted itself to his needs without any apparent control. Mechanism. Jake realized that the Zirathi had created technology that was so advanced it had become almost alive, responding to thoughts and emotions rather than simple commands. This gave him an idea that might be his only chance for survival. If the ship's systems could read his intentions, perhaps he could learn to influence them in return. During his conversations with the Countess, Jake began asking questions about Zirathi history and culture that seemed motivated by genuine curiosity rather than escape plans. He learned that her people had once been as passionate and creative as humans, but their long lives had gradually worn away their capacity for innovation and risk-taking. They had become so focused on preserving their accumulated knowledge that they had stopped learning new things. The Countess spoke wistfully of the early days of her life, when everything had seemed new and exciting. She described adventures and discoveries that had filled her with joy, but admitted that she had not felt such emotions in centuries. The essence extraction sessions were giving her temporary bursts of vitality, but she was beginning to realize that what she truly missed was the human capacity for wonder and growth. Jake began to understand that the Zirathi had trapped themselves in a cycle of stagnation. Their technology could provide them with anything they wanted, but it could not give them reasons to want anything new. They had become like children with too many toys, bored and listless, despite having access to wonders that other species could only dream of possessing. While Jake was learning about his captors, Lisa Hayes was making discoveries of her own in her section of the ship. Her pilot instincts had led her examine the energy flows she could observe through her quarters' transparent walls, and she had begun to recognize patterns in the ship's operations. The Zirathi vessel was incredibly complex, but it followed logical principles that a skilled human navigator could eventually understand. Lisa discovered that the ship's detention systems were designed to contain species that thought in predictable patterns. The Zirathi had encountered many different alien races over their long history, but all those species had evolved along similar lines toward order and stability. Humans were different because they had learned to thrive on chaos and change, making their thinking patterns difficult for Zirathi technology to predict or control. By moving through her quarters in seemingly random ways and thinking about multiple escape plans simultaneously, Lisa found that she could confuse the monitoring systems that were supposed to track her activities. The ship's computer could not decide which of her many potential actions to prepare for, creating small gaps in its surveillance that she could potentially exploit. Carl Brooks was having similar success with the engineering systems he could access from his quarters. The Zirathi had given him limited access to technical information as a way to keep him occupied and prevent him from becoming depressed or violent. They did not realize that human engineers were trained to see connections and possibilities that other species might miss. Carr began to understand that the ship's power distribution network was vulnerable to the kind of creative thinking that humans excelled at using. The Zirathi had built redundancies and safeguards into every system, but they had designed them to prevent logical attacks that followed predictable patterns. A human who could think outside established rules might be able to cause cascading failures that the ship's automatic systems could not anticipate or prevent. Danny White was learning the most disturbing information of all from his position near the medical facilities. Through careful observation and conversations with other prisoners, he discovered that the Countess was not the only Zirathi noble conducting essence extraction experiments. The entire ship was essentially a mobile laboratory where dozens of alien scientists were trying to find ways to restore their species' lost vitality. The other prisoners included humans from several different worlds, along with members of other young species that the Zirathi believed might possess the life force they needed. Most of the subjects were dying slowly from repeated extractions, but the alien doctors seemed to view this as an acceptable cost for their research. They were treating sentient beings like laboratory animals, caring only about the results they could obtain. Danny realized that even if Jake could somehow survive his treatment sessions, there were dozens of other prisoners who would continue to suffer and die unless something was done to stop the experiments entirely. The medical facilities contained equipment that could potentially help the weakened prisoners recover, but only if someone could gain control of the systems and turn them against their alien. Operators. Jake began to implement a plan that relied on the very human traits that the Countess found so fascinating. Instead of trying to resist the extraction sessions, he started to cooperate more fully while secretly using his connection to the alien technology to plant subtle suggestions and modifications in the ship's systems. Each time the extraction device linked his mind to the ship's network, he left behind small changes that would accumulate over time. The Countess noticed that Jake seemed to be adapting better to the procedures, and she increased the frequency of the sessions in her eagerness to gain more of his life force. She did not realize that each session was giving Jake more opportunities to influence the ship's operations, or that his apparent cooperation was actually part of a much larger plan. Jake's human ability to think in terms of long-term consequences and complex strategies was something the Zirathi had lost over their extended lifespans. They had become focused on immediate results and predictable outcomes, making it difficult for them to recognize or counter the subtle sabotage that Jake was implementing throughout their ship systems. As Jake grew physically weaker from the repeated extractions, his understanding of Zirathi technology grew stronger. He was learning to turn their own advanced systems against them, using human creativity and adaptability to find weaknesses that the aliens had never imagined could exist. Jake found himself in quarters that were more luxurious than any hotel he had ever seen on Earth. The room was enormous, with walls that seemed to be made from polished stone that glowed with soft inner light. A bed large enough for 5 people sat in the center of the space, covered with fabrics that felt like silk but shimmered with colors that had no names in human language. Strange plants grew in corners of the room, their leaves moving gently despite the absence of any breeze. Bathroom contained a pool-sized bathing area filled with water that maintained perfect temperature without any visible heating system. Shelves held bottles of liquids and powders that smelled like flowers Jake had never encountered, and mirrors showed his reflection from angles that seemed impossible. Everything in the room was designed for comfort and beauty, but Jake noticed there were no windows and only one door that would not open when he approached it. Food appeared on a table near the bed without any warning or sound. The meals consisted of fruits that tasted like combinations of Earth foods but looked completely alien, along with bread-like substances that filled his stomach while seeming to weigh nothing at all. Water came from a fountain that emerged from the wall when he felt thirsty, and the liquid was purer and more refreshing than anything he had ever tasted. Countess Zarathil visited him every day, always arriving unannounced, as if she could simply walk through solid walls. She wore different robes each time, all of them more beautiful than the last, and she brought gifts that demonstrated the advanced technology of her people. Holographic displays showed him images of worlds beyond imagination. Music boxes played songs that seemed to come from his own memories, and jewels created light patterns that told stories without words. During these visits, the Countess explained more about her people and their situation. The Zirathi had ruled a vast empire for thousands of years, spreading across dozens of star systems and creating works of art and technology that lesser species could barely comprehend. They were born to live for millennia, with each individual accumulating wisdom and power over centuries of existence. But something had gone wrong with their natural cycle. The Countess told Jake that she was over 3,000 years old, though she appeared to be no older than a human woman in her 20s. She had ruled her section of the empire for 8 centuries and had seen civilizations rise and fall like waves on a beach. However, recently she had begun to feel her life force weakening in ways that her people's medical technology could not explain or prevent. Her scientists had studied the problem for decades and discovered that the Zirathi were losing something essential that they had once possessed naturally. Their long lives had become a burden rather than a blessing, as they found themselves unable to feel the vitality and passion that had once driven their species to greatness. They had become observers of life rather than participants, watching events unfold with detached interest rather than genuine emotion. The breakthrough had come when Xerathi explorers first encountered human settlements on the frontier worlds. Something about human biology created energy patterns that the Xerathi had lost over their long evolutionary journey. Humans lived short lives, but filled them with intensity and passion that the ancient aliens could no longer generate within themselves. This human life force could potentially restore what the Xerathi had sacrificed for longevity. Jake listened to these explanations with growing unease as he realized what the Countess wanted from him. She spoke of essence extraction and life force transfer as if these were simple medical procedures. But he understood that she was talking about using his life energy to restore her own vitality. She assured him that the process would not harm him permanently, but her words carried the weight of someone accustomed to taking whatever she needed regardless of the cost to others. While Jake was learning about his situation, his crew members were experiencing their own version of comfortable captivity elsewhere on the ship. Lisa Hayes had been given quarters similar to Jake's, though smaller and less elaborate. She spent her time examining every surface and object in her room, looking for weaknesses in the alien technology that might be exploited later. Her pilot training had taught her to notice details that others might miss, and she was building a mental map of everything she observed. Carl Brooks found himself fascinated, despite his circumstances, by the alien engineering systems he could observe through the transparent sections of his quarters. The Xerathi ship operated on principles that human science was only beginning to understand, using energy fields and gravity manipulation that seemed to violate known physics. He made mental notes of everything he saw, hoping to find ways to interfere with the ship's operations if the opportunity arose. Danny White had been placed in quarters near the ship's medical facilities, where he could observe Xerathi doctors working with other prisoners who had been captured before Jake's crew arrived. He discovered that humans were not the only species being held aboard the vessel, though they seemed to be treated with more care and attention than the others. Some prisoners appeared to have been there for months or even years. Through careful observation and occasional conversations with guards who spoke basic English, Danny learned that the essence extraction process had been attempted many times before with limited success. Previous subjects had either died during the procedure or had been left so weakened that they could not survive more than a few treatments. The Countess was becoming desperate to find a solution that would allow her to gain the benefits of human life force without killing her sources. During one of her visits to Jake's quarters, the Countess brought him to a laboratory where her scientists demonstrated the equipment they would use for the essence extraction. The machines looked more like works of art than medical devices, with flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Crystal formations focused energy beams that could supposedly separate life force from physical matter, without causing permanent damage to either. Jake watched as the alien scientist showed him recordings of previous attempts at the procedure. The subjects in the recordings were humans from various worlds, all of them male, as the Countess had specified that human male essence was particularly potent for her needs. Some of the men appeared to cooperate willingly, while others struggled against their restraints, but all of them emerged from the machines, looking pale and weak. The Countess explained that the process involved creating a connection between her life force and that of her human subject, allowing energy to flow from the human's natural vitality into her own depleted reserves. She claimed that humans regenerated life force much more quickly than Xerathi, making it theoretically possible to harvest energy without causing permanent harm. However, the recordings showed that theory and practice were very different things. As Jake watched the demonstrations and listened to the Countess's explanations, he began to understand that she genuinely believed she was being reasonable and fair in her treatment of him. In her mind, she was offering him luxury and comfort in exchange for something that he could supposedly spare without serious injury. She seemed unable to comprehend that what she was asking for was essentially his life, doled out in small portions. Over an extended period, the Countess told Jake that she would begin the treatment soon, as her condition was becoming more serious with each passing day. She assured him that he would be well cared for throughout the process and that his Cooperation would be rewarded with privileges and freedoms that other prisoners did not enjoy. She spoke as if she was offering him a business partnership rather than preparing to slowly drain his life away for her own benefit. Jake realized that he was trapped in a situation where his captor saw herself as benevolent and reasonable, making it impossible to appeal to her sense of justice or morality. The Countess had lived for so long and accumulated so much power that human concerns seemed insignificant to her, like the worries of insects might seem to humans. He would need to find another way to protect himself and his crew before the treatments began. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair watching the stars drift past the view screen of the Starbound Pioneer. The small exploration ship had been traveling for 3 weeks through the Outer Rim territories, mapping new systems and looking for planets that might support human colonies. It was routine work, but Jake enjoyed the quiet moments between discoveries when he could think about home and the family he had left behind on Earth. Lisa Hayes worked at the pilot station, her fingers dancing over the navigation controls as she adjusted their course toward the next system on their survey list. She had been flying ships for 10 years and could navigate through an asteroid field with her eyes closed. Carl Brooks sat at the engineering station, monitoring the ships, systems, and making small adjustments to keep everything running smoothly. Danny White, their medic, was in the back checking their medical supplies and making sure everyone stayed healthy during the long journey. The 4 of them had been working together for 2 years, and they made a good team. Jake trusted each of them with his life, and they had proven themselves capable in dangerous situations many times before. They were exploring space that no human had ever seen, charting new worlds and preparing the way for future colonists who would make new homes among the stars. The alarm system suddenly started beeping, and Lisa looked up from her controls with concern. She ran a quick scan of the area around their ship and found something that made her blood run cold. A massive alien vessel had appeared on their sensors, moving toward them at incredible speed. The ship was unlike anything in human records, with strange curves and angles that seemed to flow like water frozen in metal. Jake stood up from his chair and moved to look over Lisa's shoulder at the readings. The alien ship was enormous, at least 50 times larger than their small exploration vessel. Its hull gleamed with a dark metallic surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols glowed along its sides in colors that human eyes could barely process. And energy readings showed weapon systems far beyond anything Earth had ever developed. Carl's voice was tight with worry as he reported from the engineering station that their engines were being affected by some kind of energy field coming from the alien ship. The Starbound Pioneer was slowing down despite his efforts to maintain their speed, as if invisible hands were grasping their hull and pulling them backward. Danny came running from the back of the ship to see what was happening, his medical bag in his hand and ready for whatever emergency might come. The alien vessel moved with fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It positioned itself directly in front of the human ship, blocking their path and filling the view screen with its intimidating presence. Jake tried to contact Earth to report their situation, but their communications were being blocked by the same energy field. That was affecting their engines. A new sound filled the bridge as an alien transmission came through their speakers. The voice was melodic and beautiful, speaking in perfect English with an accent that seemed almost musical. The speaker identified herself as Countess Zarathiel of the Zarathi Empire, and she informed Jake that his ship and crew were now under her protection and authority. Jake tried to respond, explaining that they were peaceful explorers who meant no harm to anyone. But the alien countess interrupted him with gentle but firm words. She told him that she understood their mission and respected their peaceful intentions, but that circumstances required her to bring them aboard her vessel for their mutual benefit. She spoke as if she was doing them a favor rather than capturing them. The energy field around their ship grew stronger, and Jake watched helplessly as the Starbound Pioneer was drawn into a docking bay inside the alien vessel. The bay was enormous, filled with strange machinery and dozens of other ships from different worlds. Some of the vessels looked familiar enough to be understood, while others were so alien that Jake could not even guess how they might function. As soon as their ship was secured in the docking bay, Jake felt the artificial gravity shift to match the alien vessel systems. The air pressure changed slightly, and he could smell something like flowers mixed with ozone coming through their ventilation system. Carl reported that their ship systems were being scanned by powerful sensors. But the scans did not seem to be causing any damage. Armed aliens entered the docking bay and surrounded their ship. The creatures were tall and elegant, with pale skin that seemed to glow with inner light. They wore elaborate armor that looked more like artwork than military equipment, and they moved with graceful precision that spoke of centuries of training. Their faces were beautiful in an otherworldly way, with large eyes that held intelligence far beyond human understanding. Jake made the decision to surrender peacefully, rather than risk his crew's lives in a hopeless fight. He ordered Lisa, Carl, and Danny to power down their weapons and prepare to meet their captors with dignity. The alien soldiers who boarded their ship were polite and professional, treating the humans with respect while making it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. The leader of the boarding party introduced himself as Commander Veltar and explained that the Countess had requested to meet with Captain Morrison personally. Jake was separated from his crew, who were escorted to comfortable quarters elsewhere in the ship, while he was led through corridors that seemed designed to impress visitors with their beauty and power. The walls of the alien ship were covered with intricate patterns that seemed to move and change as Jake watched them. Soft music played from hidden speakers, and the air was filled with scents that reminded him of gardens he had visited as a child. Everything about the ship spoke of a civilization that had perfected the arts of beauty and comfort over thousands of years. Commander Veltar led Jake through a series of increasingly elaborate chambers, each one more impressive than the last. They passed rooms filled with alien nobles wearing flowing robes and jewelry that sparkled with inner fire. The aliens watched Jake with curious eyes, whispering to each other in their musical language as he passed by. Finally, Jake was brought to the most magnificent chamber he had ever seen. The room was enormous, with a ceiling that seemed to stretch up into infinity. Starlight filtered through transparent sections of the hull, casting moving patterns of light across walls decorated with precious metals and gems. In the center of the room sat a throne made from what appeared to be crystallized moonlight. On the throne sat Countess Zeraphil, and Jake understood immediately why her voice had sounded so beautiful over the communication system. She was the most striking being he had ever encountered, with features that seemed perfect in every detail. Her skin glowed with the same inner light as her soldiers, but brighter and more intense. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, and her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of experience and wisdom. The Countess stood as Jake approached, moving with fluid grace that made human movement seem clumsy by comparison. She wore robes that seemed to be made from captured starlight, and jewelry that pulsed with energies Jake could not identify. When she spoke, her voice filled the chamber with music that seemed to resonate in his bones. She welcomed Jake to her ship and apologized for the necessity of bringing him here against his will. She explained that she had a problem that only humans could solve, and that his arrival in her territory was a fortunate coincidence that might benefit them both. She spoke of ancient secrets and desperate needs, of a quest for something that had been lost to her people for generations. Jake listened carefully, trying to understand what the alien countess wanted from him while looking for any opportunity to ensure his crew's safety and eventual freedom.